I'm Lori Lossie. I am the lead pastor here at Stillwaters Church, and I've been here for about 3 months. And Guy asked if I would speak about finding your calling. And so here's how I guess the very first thing that I wanted to say, I've got kind of just a couple sections that I'm going to cover here. First, knowing that this is career connection, I thought I'd just do a quick connection between calling and jobs. And the way I kind of see this is there's some different possibilities for how calling and jobs are related. One is sometimes your calling and your job are the same thing. And that's my case. And so God, I felt, called me into ordained ministry, and here I am, and it happens to be my job as well. That's not the case for everybody. It is for many. Sometimes there's a model I would call the Apostle Paul model. Paul, if you're familiar with the New Testament and the Bible, wrote a bunch of the New Testament, and he had this calling to really spread the gospel in the early church in the first century. And his job was as a tent maker. And so in that case, his job was his living, his way of keeping alive, but it allowed his calling to happen, which actually wasn't a source of income at all. So sometimes that's going to be a relationship where your job is simply giving you the ability to actually do your calling. The third one and the last one that I could think of, and there are probably others, is probably more complicated. Sometimes there's an interweaving kind of relationship, I would say. I've known people who they're in some sort of job and they don't consider it exactly their calling, and yet they live out some of their calling at their job. So maybe they're the person that everybody comes to, or, and so there's a piece of calling in what they do while they're there. And then they also sometimes have a sense of what they do outside their job that is also what they believe is God's call in their life. So that one's a little bit more complicated. So I would say, each of you can kind of think through those scenarios, and there's probably others that I haven't thought of. And so it could be different for each of us. So the way I was planning on structuring this talk is to give you basically two sections. One is just to share my own story and just to walk you through what happened in my life to end me up here at Stillwaters Church in Jackson. And then the second part was, and I have a handout for this part, just some kind of lessons learned or some points to think about. And I had 7 as a biblical number. I mean, I was saying 7's a biblical number. I said, well, that's good, because that's how many points I have. Usually, they're very fast. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one, so don't panic. So let me start with just my whole life journey. I feel kind of like separate from everybody, but I'll stay here because of the camera. If I wander, I'm all right to wander. All right, I'm just gonna feel a little bit less separate by walking in front here. So I, as many of you know, was born and raised here in Wisconsin. The broad picture of my life was I was here for 18 years in Wisconsin, Chicago for 5 years doing undergraduate and graduate work, Ohio for 31 years. And then back here this last July, so I'm back to Wisconsin, back home, basically. So my story is my dad is a United Methodist pastor. He's retired now, and so I was born and raised as a PK, as they called him, pastor's kid. And the things that I learned growing up, there were some kind of seeds planted. It's an interesting dynamic when you don't realize this is happening as a child, but your pastor and your dad are the same person. And so I remember experiences, and I lived in 3 different places growing up. United Methodist pastors do move periodically, and so through 2nd grade, I lived in Milton, Wisconsin. And from 3rd grade to 8th grade, I lived in Platteville, Wisconsin. And then from freshman year on was Whitefish Bay. So right around this area. So I remember, I can remember things, and I know approximately how old I was based on where they were. I remember in Milton, so this would have been 2nd grade or before, experiences of just getting up on my dad's lap and asking God questions and saying, why do you believe in God again? And why, and just kind of asking those kinds of, and he always, one thing I learned a lot about faith. I learned that there's no stupid questions. I was allowed to ask anything I wanted. And I remember that particular question. I mean, I could tell you all lots and lots of stories. I remember asking him, how come you're so sure that there's a God? And I'll never forget this. He looked at me and said, faith. And I must have had that, what are you talking about expression? And he realized I was probably a little bit old for who he was talking to. And he said, well, when you look outside and you see the trees and the leaves and the caterpillars and the butterflies and our bodies and our fingers, and he said, there's got to be a mind behind that. There's got to be. And I went, huh. So I went through life kind of asking lots of questions. And the other significant piece from those growing up years was I learned that faith was something that wasn't just talked about on Sunday morning, it was lived out. And I had the privilege of being able to watch that happen. And so what I heard my dad say about grace and forgiveness, I experienced during the course of my life and made lots of stupid mistakes, as kids do. And I found out there was nothing I'd ever do that would be outside the bounds of his and my mom's love. And so I had kind of a foundation planted. Then I got to teenage years, and so this is the other kind of direction. I'm often thinking I should ask my parents what they think about those years now, and then I think, I don't want to know. Never mind. Let's not even talk about it. But those were the years when I didn't want to be a preacher's kid anymore, and I didn't want to be a goody two-shoes, and so I went on what I call my rebellious track, and that started in high school, and then I was glad to leave at 18 and go to school, and everybody told me there was this partying and stuff, and I was like, well, that sounds like a lot of fun. So when I went to school, I moved from Whitefish Bay and then into the Chicago area. I left my Bible, I left my prayer, I left my church, I left my faith at home. And I always look back and I call it kind of the dark time of my life, really. Because even though I was telling everybody this is fun, there was something in my soul all that time that said this is not actually right. So I finished college, went to graduate school also in the Chicago area, and then I had a job offer at that point to go to Columbus, Ohio. So that was why I went to Ohio. And yet it's something in me at that time was saying something's got to change in my life. I know it. I can't live this way forever. And there had been a church. Someday I'm going to visit this church again. Downers Grove United Methodist. And I had seen it, passed it 1,000 times, and I had noticed the times of worship on Sunday morning. And so one Sunday before I moved, I went into that church and just participated in the worship service and went up to the front row or up toward the front. And the pastor, I don't even remember what was talked about. I remember I laughed, I cried, and at the end of that message, there was one of those churches with the rail at the front, and he said, if anybody feels like they'd like to have a time of prayer, you're welcome to come forward. And I thought, I definitely need that. And so I went forward, and my prayer was very simple. I simply prayed something like, I am so sorry. And if you, Lord, can ever forgive me, I'll be yours. And so that was kind of a turn back. Looking back, I always say that was when the faith that I had was no longer just passed down. It was now my own. And so then I moved to Ohio and started my job in similar to some of those here, software development and working for AT&T Bell Labs. And the job was fine. I liked it okay, liked the people there, and knew that I had just made a commitment to God and I was going to find a church, so I found a church and loved the church that I found and got very involved. And it was one of those where whatever they offered, that's what I was going to do. You know, if there was a Bible study, I was there. If there was a collection of food for the food pantry, I was at the store collecting food for the food pantry. And so I got involved in small groups and then leading small groups, and the choir director asked me if I'd join the choir, and I thought, she doesn't know me very well. But I said, sure. So I got in the choir. and then I got involved with the young adult small group, and they would play guitar and sing. You know, we just gather and do some Bible study. And then they started a praise band, and they said, and I noticed that they said, let's just start this praise band. So we did. And I always stepped away from the mic, but I did that for a little while too. And started to notice that my job was okay, but what I really couldn't wait for were all my evening meetings and all my weekend times at church. And one day, our pastor was giving a sermon on Sunday morning. And it was on God's calling. And I'll never forget this. And I found him later because I didn't respond right at that moment. But he just looked at us and he said, you know, there may be some in this room. And he looked at me. And he looked at all, I mean, I'm sure he made contact with everybody, but just felt like it was me. And he said, who are called into ordained ministry. And of course, at that point, I said, I got all these other things going on. I went down this road. By the way, isn't it interesting that when we're in college, many of us were totally disconnected from the church and from God and asking for His will? I've thought about that a lot. So at that time, I thought, just kind of like Moses in the burning bush, no, there's too many reasons, I just can't do that. And so I continued on, and then it was probably a year or two later, that pastor had moved on, another one was there, and it was really during kind of more personal prayer time, just a discipline of asking God each morning to use me and to show me and to direct me, and it kind of hit me, and I thought, I'm really needing to go in this other direction. I really feel like this is God's call on my life. And I think I shared this one on Sunday morning at church at one point, but I called my parents, and I was the rebellious kid, remember? And I said, guess what? I'm going to seminary. There's this silence, and I hear my mom say, is this Lori? And even my dad was kind of like, well, why don't you just go and try a class and see how it is? And so I said, okay. So that started a whole different direction. And actually during that time period, my job, which I continued to stay at while I was in seminary, was kind of like Paul's. It was funding my calling, my preparing for my calling. And then graduated, and then was appointed to my first church in Ohio, and then 7 years later, the second church, and then now I'm here, and this is the third church I have been appointed to. And I will say, by the way, a lot of times when we think of call, we think of great, big life the whole reason I'm here, and that's part of it. But I will say, every time I've come to a church, every time I've been in a different stage of life, you're still always asking God's direction, God's call, sometimes it's major, sometimes it's a redirection, and so that's always a part of who I am, who I believe we're called to be. So that is my story, and that's my call. And like I said, I came up with some quick things to go through, and I created copies because I always think everybody's like me, which I know is not true. But I personally like to have written stuff, and I like to write notes. And so if any of you are like that, you can feel free to either just watch it or write little thoughts that come to your mind as I share these points. But these are kind of 7 things that I thought up, and they're actually very much in line with what you shared earlier. Just kind of really an expansion on some of those thoughts. I think when you talk about God's call, there's certain things you're definitely going to cover. So here are some things that I thought, as you all are contemplating, does God have, He does have a call on you. What is that? So first one, listen to seeds, and maybe I should say pay attention to seeds planted early. And again, I can say from my perspective, there were seeds that I've mentioned. This whole understanding that church and faith and life and God, it's all, for me, it was so interwoven that I can't pull that apart. That has become a part of who I am. And I realize not everybody is like that as I've gone into the world. And so that was kind of a seed that was planted in my life. And by the way, I always want to say, if you think you're called into ministry, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a preacher's kid background. And so I know some tremendous pastors who actually had no church background at all growing up. And it's the old, sometimes you learn from the negative. Sometimes, some pastors had such a negative experience or no experience that they had a sense for how it should be. And so listen also to the negative stuff that you've learned from in your past, as well as the positive. But those seeds that were planted, other seeds, kinds of things, and again, we're kind of at the very beginning here, but what did teachers say? Did they say, "Oh gosh, you're so good at," or what did people notice? What did other people comment on or share with you? What excited you, even as a kid? I had a friend who was a pilot, and he said, ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to fly, and it was just one of those things. So, thinking back, if there is anything from those beginning years, those formative years in your life that you just take note of. Second thing, look at your gifts and your strengths. And many of you know there's lots of gift assessments, spiritual gifts, strength finders. There's tons of these that are out there for you to discern your gifts. And what are they for you? Do you have gifts of leadership, gifts of compassion, gifts of discernment, gifts of teaching, gifts of wisdom? There's gifts of building. My dad, although a pastor, had this carpentry gift. And I would say he used that pretty well. But I'll never forget going to my aunt and uncle's for Thanksgiving, and they always had these Lincoln logs. And my dad would always say to my sister and I, "Look at this, what are we going to build?" And we'd be like, "I don't know, Dad." But that was his gift, and he thought everybody should be excited about it. And what are your gifts? And what are your strengths? And I will say that look beyond the obvious. And actually my dad's degree was in engineering. My degrees are in math and computers. The obvious one for me, people always said, "Oh, you're good at math, you're going to do something in that." And I was an introvert, so people didn't notice that I had some discernment gifts or, some wisdom, some other kind of gifts that would emerge later. And so I would say, if you're thinking about your gifts, don't look at just the obvious ones. Those are probably ones you've already thought of. But look beneath the surface, which means maybe if you take those gift inventories, you might uncover some of those. So look at your gifts and your strengths. And by the way, and many of you know this, if you are in a place where it's a mismatch, it's horrible. And I just had a brief stint at that. When I was in college, I wanted to get a part-time job. And so I was walking down the street about a block from where I lived in the dorms, and there was a sign that said part-time work available or something, help wanted. And I went in, and it was an art gallery. And I don't have an artistic bone in my body, but it said help wanted. And so I said, I'm help, do you want me? And I don't know why they hired me. But they did. It seemed like it was a very informal thing. I think it was a brand new shop. Anyway, so I come for my first day, and I said, what do I do? And they said, well, why don't you make some coffee? And I made some coffee, and then I said, now what do I do? And they said, well, help the customers. Well, there was like one customer per hour. And when they did come, they knew more about art than I did. And it was one of those where after a week or two, I thought, either I'm going to get fired or I'm going to quit. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I'm really not helping at all here. And so we parted ways. But that's rough, when you're in a mismatch. And some of you may have been in mismatches for much longer than the short time that I was in that. And that's got to be very wearing on your spirit. All right, so then also look at your passions. And again, I think I heard this in what you were talking about, Tom, earlier from Covey. What do you love? Do you love kids? Do you love working with elderly? Do you love math? Do you love IT? Do you love, what are the things that you just, I would kind of put it like this. If you had time off and you got through all the stuff that you would normally do on time off, like taking care of the house and sleeping forever, and if you got through all of that, what would you want to wake up and just do the whole day long? That would be a passion. So think about that. All right, the fourth one, look at ways that God works through brokenness. Sometimes in our lives we go through rough stuff. Actually, most of us go through rough stuff at one level in one way or another. And sometimes we think that's just something to get through. And what I've noticed over time is our God is a God that redeems tough things, redeems trouble, redeems struggle. And so he redeemed the cross, and he saved the world through that horrible moment in time. And he does the same with us. And last week I was at the Heroin Task Force breakfast, and a woman stood up and she said that she was an alcoholic, and she was 30 years or a long time, I forget exactly, sober. And she said now she was leading support groups for family members of alcoholics and addicts. And I could tell you story after story of people who have been through difficult things and who then use that time. And she is able to minister to folks in ways that many of us could not. I knew a woman who had grown up in a house where there were drugs. She ran away as a teenager. She got into a life of prostitution. She had a lot of brokenness. And eventually she wanted to get out of that. And she sought healthy help. She found it. And now she has this amazing ability to kind of reach prostitutes and drug addicts who want to get out of that. And she can reach folks like nobody else can, because she's been there. I knew of folks who have been through process of grief and do grief share, and just various ways that in our brokenness we are able to minister in ways that nobody else can. Something to think about. And actually, you know, my broken period, those years in college, what I find, you know, you hate to admit, this is what I did, this is who I was, but what I found is that has always created this. I always have people coming, yeah, I did that too, you know, and it's created a path of ministry and of connection, and I always am reminded that my brokenness and my failures keep me humble. So if I ever think I'm all that, all I have to do is remember who I've been, and then I know the truth. All right, so brokenness is another thing to think about. And then I wrote, listen to God. What do you all think about when I say listen to God? There's like an immediate answer that you might, and you're probably afraid it's going to be a wrong one. Prayer. That's what I would say if somebody asked me that. And the only thing I want to say about listen to God is we live in a fast-paced world, and we like fast answers. And I did fast food tonight for dinner, and, you know, got in a line and didn't want to be in a line. And I had a question about something, and I did a quick Google search. And so if we're not careful, we bring that mentality to God. And we say, God, I want my answer. And then we say, why isn't he answering me? Because we just kind of expect it. And if anything, when I became a parent, over the years, I began to understand a little bit more of the nature of God, who is our heavenly parent. And if any of you are parents, you know that if you're separate from your child for a long time, say 5 years, and they call you up and say, well, what should I do about this? You can give them some advice, but you've been disconnected for so long. What do you really desire as a parent is relationship. You desire to be there when they got home and they were bullied, and the day that their boyfriend dumped them, and the day that they got that A on that test finally, and you build that relationship. And it was really awesome, at least for me, maybe not for my daughter. She went out to eat with some of my friends, and she came home and she said, Mom, they said I acted just like you. I said, cool. I don't think she was as happy. But when it comes to listening to God, God is trying to recreate us in his image, and he's trying to have our hearts beat at one with his. He would rather not just feed us an answer so we can run off again. He wants to walk with us. And so listening to God, in my mind, is more than a quick prayer. It's really, and I call them spiritual disciplines, but prayer and worship and gathering with other Christians or folks that are mentors, and we walk together. And so keep that in mind as it's God's calling. So it is all about God's purpose for you and his will for your life. And so to best understand that, I always say, and I'm sure I'm quoting somebody else, I just don't know who on this, I want my heart to break for the things that God's heart breaks, and I want my heart to rejoice for the things that God's heart is rejoicing. And when my heart is in tune with his, when your heart is in tune with his, you start to sense, based on who you are in him, not just on an answer he gave you, that you can just run and do. All right, the other ones, ask others. Hopefully that's exactly what's happening here. You're networking, you're asking, you're You're communicating with other people. When I sensed God's call, I was talking to my pastor. I was talking to other trusted friends. I was saying, "Am I crazy? Because I need to know if I am." And they said, "Yes, you are, but you should still go into ministry." But that's important, because we get so lost in our own thoughts that we need outside perspectives. And then the final one, this is kind of sums it all up, really. Where is there an intersection of the needs of this world, of which there are so many, and your gifts, your strengths, and your passions? Where is the intersection of here's the broken world that we live in, and here's you. And you were created with these gifts and these passions and abilities, and where does that? And so I started listing, needs, addiction, abuse, kids who just need to be taught, poverty on the other sides of the world, poverty nearby. Disasters, as we all know, is happening right now, and we know that there's going to be need after this hurricane goes through. After school programming, helping elderly, giving rides to folks, sitting with nursing in a nursing facility, people who are lonely. The needs are endless, and as a pastor, that's overwhelming until I realize it's all about all of us being used and using our own gifts and meeting those needs one person at a time, and together we do it. So, all right, that is what I had, and I don't know if you want to do questions or if you have follow-up or how you want to go.
Any questions, any discussion that you want to have on this subject, this topic? I think you should turn it into a TED Talk.
Oh, a what talk?
Heard of TED Talks before? You have to pare it down to 18 minutes, but it's a good TED Talk.
Well, actually, I have done that. It's called a sermon. No, I can't do 7 points in a sermon. Anything else?
Well, this is very interesting. It's
Thank you.
Some of the things that Pastor talked about and that Tom did also is there's an interesting book on that subject called, it's by Steve Covey. It's called The Eighth Habit. If you haven't read it, it's a good one. And the eighth habit is finding your voice, and your voice is your calling. That's what he's talking about. And so if you want to read something good on that subject, that's an excellent book to read.
Great.
He couldn't do 7 points either, apparently.
No.
That's right. It's real hard.
I have a question.
Okay.
Did your dad ever see that in you? Did he ever sense that, your mom and your dad?
Sense the calling?
Your calling of being a pastor?
I don't think so. Like I said, I kind of went through different stages in my life. My very young years, I was very introverted. In fact, I remember them telling me that my mom tried to take me to preschool, and I stayed in the corner for 3 days, and she said, "This isn't working." But that was part of my discernment gift. I'm very much I've learned this about myself. I'm a high context person. I need to understand my context, and I watch a lot, and then I learn, and then I'm able to share now. But I was real quiet as a kid until I got rebellious, and then it wasn't showing up. So it really wasn't until I think I was an adult and was no longer at home that I started to really live my faith as an adult. So I don't think so. I think they were genuinely surprised when I called. But now we have, more fun than anything. My dad and I talk about everything ministry under the sun.
Any other questions for Pastor Lori? All right, thank you very much, Pastor Lori.